The summer of 1961 was not kind to Harlan County, Nebraska. It was the kind of July that split the earth open, that cracked the topsoil like old leather boots left too long on a radiator. The kind of heat that made the meadowlarks go quiet before noon and left the dogs too exhausted to even lift their heads from the dirt. And on the afternoon of July the 14th, on a 312-acre parcel of land along the South Fork of the Republican River, a man named Eldon Pruitt did something that would make every farmer within 20 miles shake his head and laugh out loud. He picked up a rock. Not to throw it, not to curse it. He picked it up, looked at it the way some men look at a Bible verse that's been nagging them for years, patient, deliberate, like he was in a conversation with it, and he walked it slowly, deliberately to the fence line. And he set it down. And then he went back and got another one. Let me tell you about Eldon Pruitt. Harlan County sits in the south-central belly of Nebraska, pressed against the Kansas border like a hand resting on a warm stone. In 1961, it was a county of three things: wheat, cattle, and wind. Always wind. The kind of wind that didn't announce itself, that just arrived sometime in March and never quite left, that bent the cottonwood sideways and taught every child born there to walk with one shoulder slightly raised, as if bracing for something. The land along the South Fork of the Republican River had been farmed hard since the late 1800s. By 1961, it showed its age. The glacier that had ground across Nebraska 10,000 years before had left behind what geologists called a till plain, a flat-bottomed quilt of some of the richest soil in the Western Hemisphere. But mixed into that soil, heaved upward by generations of frost and thaw, were rocks. Not the dramatic sandstone boulders of Wyoming or the granite outcroppings of Minnesota. These were smaller, meaner rocks. Limestone slabs the size and shape of old hardback Bibles. Flint nodules that snapped plow blades like dry kindling. Chunks of quartzite that could wrench a cultivator sideways at 5 miles an hour and leave a man's wrists aching for a week. Every spring plowing, the rocks came up. Every spring, farmers across the county muttered the same profanities, loaded the rocks into the beds of their pickup trucks or their wagon beds and drove them to the lowest corner of their property, the waste ground, the draws, the creek banks, and dumped them. Rocks were a problem to be discarded. Rocks were the enemy of the plow. Rocks were worthless. Every farmer in Harlan County knew that. Every farmer except Eldon Pruitt. Eldon Pruitt was 61 years old in the summer of 1961, which meant he had been born into a sod house in 1900, the same year the county finally got a telephone exchange in Alma. He was the third son of a Czech immigrant named Antonin Pruitt, born Antonin Prucha, a name the immigration officer at Galveston had simplified with a stroke of his pen in 1893. Antonin had arrived in Nebraska with $11, a pocket knife, and a determination that his children would own the ground beneath their feet. By the time Eldon was 7, he was driving a team of horses. By 12, he was breaking sod with a sulky plow on a 40-acre parcel his father had purchased for $320. By the time he came back from France in 1918, 19 years old, 30 pounds lighter, with a frostbite scar across 2 toes on his left foot that he never talked about, he came home to a farm that was struggling but still standing. He farmed that ground for the next 43 years. By 1961, Eldon Pruitt was what the people of Harlan County called a quiet farmer. Not quiet because he was dull or simple. Quiet the way deep wells are quiet. The depth of him wasn't visible from the surface. He stood 5 feet 9 in his work boots, which were resoled so many times the cobblers in Alma had stopped keeping track. His hands were the color of creek mud and had the texture of old saddle leather. He wore the same style of denim overalls his whole adult life. Oshkosh, Bigosh, double knee, size 38, and he owned 3 identical pairs, cycling through them with the kind of systematic efficiency that a man develops when he doesn't have the luxury of carelessness. He had farmed through the Dust Bowl. He had farmed through the Depression. He had farmed through 2 wars and a drought in 1956 that turned his winter wheat crop to brown straw in the field. He had buried his wife Marta in the spring of 1954, and he had plowed his north field the very next morning because Marta had told him to the week before she passed. "The ground doesn't wait for grief, Eldon," she had said. "You plant when it's time." He had one son, Raymond, who had gone to Lincoln for college and stayed for engineering. They wrote letters twice a month. It was enough. Eldon Pruitt was not a man who sought attention. He was not a man who needed to be understood. He just needed his land to survive. Now let me introduce you to Gerald Kuhn. Gerald Kuhn was 38 years old in 1961, the son of the most prosperous farm equipment dealer in Harlan County. His father, Herman Kuhn, had built Kuhn Implement on Main Street in Alma in 1939, and by the time Gerald inherited the dealership in 1958, it represented John Deere exclusively and generated somewhere in the neighborhood of $220,000 in annual sales, a sum that in Harlan County in the early 1960s was the rough equivalent of owning a small principality. Gerald Kuhn drove a 1960 Chevrolet Impala in a color the factory called Honduras Maroon, a deep burgundy that had no business being within 10 miles of a dirt road. He had it washed and waxed at the Texaco station in Alma every Thursday morning, rain or shine. He wore button-down shirts with the sleeves rolled 2 turns, and he wore them untucked in a way that in 1961 felt to older men like a small, deliberate insult. He was not, strictly speaking, a bad man. He loved his children. He attended First Lutheran Church with his wife, Darlene. He sponsored the Harlan County 4-H auction table every August. But Gerald Kuhn had grown up watching his father's customers, the struggling farmers, the men who came in hat in hand to ask about payment plans, and somewhere along the line, he had drawn a conclusion about those men that was not kind. He had decided that poverty was a form of personal failure, that the men who couldn't upgrade their equipment, who nursed aging machines past their reasonable lifespan, who refused to modernize, were not stubborn or resourceful or wise. They were simply behind. And being behind, in Gerald Kuhn's philosophy, was a moral condition as much as a financial one. He was the kind of man who used the word obsolete the way a doctor uses the word terminal, with regret, of course, with the appropriate gravity, but with a certainty that foreclosed all further conversation. By 1961, Gerald Kuhn had been telling Eldon Pruitt for 3 consecutive years that his farming operation was obsolete. The argument, if you could call it that, because Eldon Pruitt rarely argued, had been building since 1958. That was the year Gerald Kuhn's dealership began pushing the John Deere Model 730 diesel tractor in earnest. A beautiful machine, no question, with its 2-cylinder engine that fired with a distinctive pop-pop-pop that you could hear from half a mile away on a clear morning. The 730 could pull a 4-bottom plow through heavy clay soil at a speed that made the old Farmall M look like a man walking. And Gerald Kuhn had been making sure every farmer in Harlan County understood that. Eldon Pruitt's primary tractor, as of 1961, was a 1948 Farmall M he'd bought it new, 14 years prior, for $1,085, and he had maintained it with the obsessive, almost devotional attention of a man who understood that the machine was not a convenience but a partner. The engine had been rebuilt once in 1955 by Eldon himself, in the machine shed behind his house, during 3 weeks of January when the temperature never climbed above 12 degrees. The carburetor had been recalibrated 4 times. The magneto was replaced in 1959. The front cultivator mount had been reinforced with gusset plates that Eldon had cut himself from 1/4-inch steel plate with a cold chisel and a hacksaw. It was not a new tractor, but it ran the way a healthy 60-year-old man runs, not fast but true, and for a very long time. Gerald Kuhn did not see it that way. The confrontation that everyone in Harlan County would remember happened at Vander Beek's feed store on a Wednesday morning in late May of 1961. It was the kind of morning where the farmers came in early, before the heat settled in, to collect supplies and exchange the particular slow-moving conversation that is the currency of men who work alone. Eldon Pruitt was buying a bag of twine and a box of hardware fittings. Gerald Kuhn was there dropping off a John Deere parts catalog, always working, always selling. There were 7 or 8 other farmers present: Harold Sveck, Lester Horak, the Winkelbauer brothers Dale and Don, men who would remember this morning for the rest of their lives. "Eldon," Gerald said, loud enough for everyone to hear, in the tone of a man who wants an audience but doesn't want to admit he wants one. "I drove past your south field yesterday, all those rocks still sitting there in the north corner." Eldon didn't look up from the bin of hardware fittings he was sorting through. "They are," he said. "Must be 30-40 acres you can't plow in that corner," Gerald continued. "All that ground just sitting there wasted because of those rocks. You know what that costs you every year? At current wheat prices, that's got to be, what, $800-900 in lost yield every single year." "Could be," Eldon said. "I've got a 730 diesel that could handle those rocks differently. You clear that ground, you plant it properly, you're looking at a return on investment in 3 years, maybe less." Now, Eldon did look up. He looked at Gerald Kuhn with the patient, specific attention of a man who has heard a sound and is trying to determine whether it's a threat or just the wind. "Gerald," he said, "I appreciate the thought. Eldon, that old M of yours, I'm not trying to be harsh here, but that machine is 15 years old. You're leaving money in the field every season. Everybody in this room knows it." Harold Sveck studied the floor. Lester Horak found something interesting to look at near the window. The Winkelbauer brothers glanced at each other with the careful neutrality of men who don't want to get caught choosing sides. Eldon Pruitt picked up his box of fittings and his bag of twine. He looked at Gerald Kuhn one more time, and then he said something that nobody in Vander Beek's feed store fully understood at the time. "Gerald, those rocks aren't waste. I know what I'm going to do with them." He paid Esther Vander Beek at the counter $2.60, and he walked out into the May morning and drove home in his 1951 Ford pickup. Gerald Kuhn watched him go, and then he laughed, not cruelly, almost kindly, the way a man laughs at something that is simply, obviously, inescapably behind the times. "Old Eldon," he said to no one in particular, "God bless him. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known something, not suspected it, not hoped it, but known it, with the kind of quiet, unshakable certainty that doesn't need to be defended because it doesn't feel threatened? That's what it feels like when knowledge is so deep it's become instinct. When the years of observation have crystallized into something that lives below the level of words." Eldon Pruitt had been watching that north corner of his south field for 30 years. Let me explain what he saw. The Republican River Valley in southern Nebraska sits at the edge of a climatic transition zone, the margin between the more reliable rainfall of the eastern Corn Belt and the more arid conditions of the western High Plains. What that meant practically for a farmer in Harlan County in the 1950s and early 1960s was that the difference between a good year and a bad year was often measured not in inches of rain, but in where that rain went after it fell. Eldon Pruitt's south field had a problem that no John Deere tractor and no modern equipment catalog could solve. The north corner of that field, the rough, rocky ground that Gerald Kuhn had identified as wasted acreage, sat at the base of a gentle slope, and every time it rained more than an inch in a short period, that slope shed water downhill in a sheet. The water moved across the field with enough force to carry topsoil with it. By Eldon's calculation, across 30 years of farming that ground, he had lost somewhere between 4 and 6 inches of topsoil from the middle of that field to the drainage ditch along the county road at the south end. 4 to 6 inches of topsoil, the work of 800 years of decomposition, of soil biology, of root systems and earthworms and frost cycles, gone in 30 years of uncontrolled runoff. And the rocky corner, that corner which everyone considered waste ground, which nobody could plow, which Gerald Kuhn could point to as evidence of Eldon's backwardness, that corner was actually the source of the problem. Because it had no planted crop, no root system, no ground cover in dry seasons, the water that hit it moved fast and kept moving, carrying everything with it. But Eldon had also noticed something else. He had noticed it first in 1931, during the particularly brutal sequence of wet springs and dry summers that preceded the Dust Bowl years. In the fields to the northwest of his property, a section farmed by an old German family named Hofmeister who had emigrated in the 1880s, there was a long stone fence line that dated back to the original breaking of the ground. The Hofmeister fence ran east to west for perhaps 400 feet along the north edge of their property. And on the downhill side of that fence, the soil was deeper, darker, richer. The water that came down the slope was slowed by the rocks, forced to drop its load of suspended soil particles before it continued on. The fence was acting as an erosion barrier, as a sediment trap, as a machine for rebuilding soil. Heinrich Hofmeister, dead by 1931, had not built that fence to save his soil. He had built it to get the rocks out of his field. But the rocks had done something in their new location that nobody had planned for. They had started working. Eldon Pruitt had spent 30 years thinking about that Hofmeister fence. He had spent 30 years looking at the rocks in his north corner, and understanding something about them that no equipment catalog and no agricultural extension bulletin had ever articulated, though the soil conservation people had been circling around the idea for a decade. The rocks were not waste, the rocks were a tool, and he finally knew exactly how to use them. He was going to build a wall. Not a fence, not a windbreak. A proper dry stack limestone wall 3 feet high, 2 feet wide at the base, running in a gentle arc across the contour of his north corner, designed to intercept the sheet flow from the slope above, slow the water, drop the sediment, and over time rebuild the topsoil that 30 years of careless runoff had stolen from him. He had read about contour farming, he had read about terracing. He understood the engineering of it intuitively, the way men who have worked land for 60 years understand water not from textbooks, but from watching it move 10,000 times. He didn't have money for a soil conservation contractor. He didn't have money for a new tractor. What he had was time, a back that still worked, and 300 acres worth of rocks that everyone else considered garbage. And he had his 1948 Farmall M. He started on the 15th of July, 1961, a Saturday. The temperature that morning was already 84 degrees by 8 o'clock. By noon, it would be 97. The humidity sat at 60%, the particular thick, close, river valley humidity that doesn't so much surround you as wear you like a coat. Eldon Pruitt rose at 4:30 as he always did. He ate oatmeal with dried apricots, Marta's recipe, still, and drank 2 cups of black coffee. He put on his Oshkosh overalls and his work boots and his old canvas hat with the sweat-stained brim that had been washed so many times it had faded from dark green to the color of river sage. He went to the machine shed. The 1948 Farmall M sat in its usual place, next to the workbench where Eldon kept his tools arranged with the same precise orderliness that a surgeon maintains over instruments. He checked the oil clean, sitting right at the full mark on the dipstick, which he wiped on the knee of his overalls from pure habit. He checked the radiator. He checked the tire pressure with a gauge that had belonged to his father. He primed the fuel line, set the throttle to the start position, and engaged the hand crank with the particular confident leverage of a man who has done this 10,000 times and has never, not once, been kicked by it. The M fired on the second turn. It settled into the specific idle rhythm of that engine, not the pop-pop of the John Deere 2-cylinder, but the deeper, more even, more constant burr of the 6-cylinder Continental. It was a sound that Eldon Pruitt heard the way other men hear their own heartbeat, so familiar it was below consciousness. He had built a stone boat. This was a low, flat steel sled about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, welded together from sections of 2-inch angle iron and a piece of half-inch steel plate that had once been a thrashing machine separator tray. It had no wheels. It was designed to slide along the ground behind the tractor. The friction kept it low, kept the rocks stable, and let it tip for unloading. Eldon had built it in the winter of 1960. He had been planning this for over a year. He hooked the stone boat to the drawbar of the M with a length of logging chain, drove out to the north corner of his south field, and began. The work was simple in the way that very hard things are simple. Walk to a rock. Assess it, weight, shape, how it would stack, whether it would be a foundation stone, a core stone, or a capstone. Lift it if you could, roll it if you couldn't, wrestle it onto the stone boat if it was too large for either, load the boat until the M couldn't have pulled it easily, drive to the wall site, unload, stack. The wall line he had chosen ran on a contour. He had sited it with a surveyor's level borrowed from his neighbor Earl Mosby, driving stakes every 20 feet until he had a line that held its elevation within 2 inches across a run of 340 feet. He had lime-washed the stakes so he could see them from the field. He had done this in April, 2 months before anyone saw him picking up the first rock. He had thought about this for 30 years. He was not going to rush it now. The stacking was the part that nobody who hadn't done it could understand. Dry stack limestone walls, built without mortar, held together only by the weight of the stone and the precision of the fit, are not built by stacking rocks. They are built by listening to rocks. Each stone has a way it wants to sit, a face that belongs on the outside, a bed that finds a particular partner in the stone below it. Eldon Pruitt had learned this from watching the old Czech and German settlers whose walls still stood, some of them 60 years old, some older, in the field margins of Harlan County. He had taken a particular interest in the walls that had survived and the walls that had collapsed, and he understood the difference. The outside faces needed to tilt slightly inward, toward the center of the wall, so that gravity worked with the structure, not against it. The largest stones went at the bottom. Every third or fourth course needed a long tie stone that ran from face to face through the full width of the wall, binding the 2 outer faces together into a single structural mass. The capstones needed to be the flattest, heaviest stones available, set across the full width to lock everything in place. He worked alone. He worked from sun up to sundown. He took 30 minutes for lunch, a cold pork sandwich, and apple water from a mason jar that he kept in the shade of the M's tire. He did not take breaks otherwise. He did not work fast. He worked at the pace of a man who is absolutely certain that what he is doing is right, and who therefore has no reason to hurry and no reason to stop. On the third day, Lester Horak drove past on the section road and saw him. He slowed his truck. He watched for a long minute. He drove on without stopping. That evening, at the Alma Cooperative elevator, Lester told Harold Sveck what he'd seen. "Old Eldon Pruitt is out there building a rock wall in that north corner," Lester said. "A rock wall," Harold said. "A rock wall, stacking those limestone pieces up, neat as you please. Got that old M hitched to a stone boat running loads." Word moved the way words move in small counties. By the end of the week, it had reached Gerald Kuhn. Gerald drove out on a Sunday afternoon, not to offer help, but to see it. He parked his Honduras maroon Impala on the section road, and he got out and he stood at the fence, and he looked at Eldon Pruitt, who was 200 yards away, walking across the rocky corner with a limestone slab in his arms, carrying it the way a man carries something precious, slowly, with intention, toward a wall that was now, after 9 days of work, about 2 feet high and roughly 120 feet long. Gerald watched for a while. He couldn't quite bring himself to shout across the distance. He got back in the Impala and he drove away. He told Dale Winklebauer about it the next morning. "He's going to hurt himself," Gerald said. "Man his age moving rocks in this heat." "He looked all right to me," Dale said. "I drove out on Thursday." "He's going to work himself to death building a wall that doesn't make any sense." "What do you mean it doesn't make sense?" "Dale, that's 40 acres of ground that hasn't been farmed in 30 years because of those rocks. He's not clearing the ground, he's just moving the rocks to one place. He'll be done and he'll have a wall and he'll still have 40 acres he can't plow." Dale Winklebauer thought about that. "Maybe he knows something we don't," he said. Gerald Kuhn shook his head slowly, with the patient, sorrowful certainty of a man who has been right about things before and expects to be right again. "He's an old man building a wall," Gerald said. "That's all it is." Eldon Pruitt completed the wall on the 14th of August, 1961. 30 days of work, 341 feet of dry stack limestone, 3 feet high at the crown, 2 feet wide at the base. He had moved, by his own rough estimate, somewhere between 40 and 50 tons of rock. He walked the length of it on the morning of the 15th. He looked at every capstone. He pressed his palms against the face of the wall in 3 different places, the way a doctor presses a stethoscope against a chest, listening. He found one section, about 20 feet from the east end, where 2 coarse stones had settled slightly out of plane. He pulled 4 capstones, reset the coarse stones, and replaced the caps. It took 40 minutes. Then he stood back and looked at the whole of it. 341 feet of wall, built from rocks that everyone in Harlan County had called worthless. He went in for lunch. The first rain came in September. Not a catastrophic rain, a standard early fall event, 2.5 inches in 4 hours, the kind that happened 2 or 3 times a year in Harlan County and that farmers accepted as a feature of the landscape. The Republican River Valley had good drainage overall, but 2.5 inches in 4 hours moved across bare ground with force. Earl Mosby, who farmed the adjacent section, happened to be driving the county road during a break in the rain. He stopped at Eldon's gate on his way home. He sat in his truck for a long time, then he drove to Eldon's house and knocked on the door. Eldon came to the door in his stocking feet, holding a cup of coffee. "Eldon," Earl said, "you'd better come look at your wall." They drove out together in Earl's truck. They got out at the fence and walked to where they could see the north corner clearly. Earl Mosby, who would recount this moment to his grandchildren 20 years later, said he didn't have words for what he saw. Behind the wall, on the uphill side, where the water had come down the slope and hit the limestone, there was a brown line of deposited silt running the full length of the structure. Not thick, maybe a 1/4 inch of fine soil particles that the water had been carrying and had been forced to drop when the wall slowed it to a stop. On the downhill side, the ground was barely wet. The wall had worked. On the very first real test, it had worked. The sheet flow from the slope had hit 341 feet of dry stack limestone at full force, had lost its velocity, had dropped its sediment load, and had percolated slowly through and around the base of the wall as clean water. The topsoil that would have washed into the drainage ditch at the south end of the field and into the Republican River and ultimately into the Gulf of Mexico, that topsoil was sitting behind Eldon Pruitt's wall. Eldon Pruitt looked at the silt line behind his wall for a long time without speaking. "Quarter-inch," he finally said. "After one rain," Earl said. "It'll build up, takes time." "Eldon, that's..." Earl Mosby stopped. He was not a man given to effusive speech. "That's something." "It's a start," Eldon said. He didn't go to Vander Beek's feed store with that information. He didn't call the extension office. He didn't tell Gerald Kuhn. He just went back to his farm and got on with the fall work. The silence in this story wasn't dramatic. There was no public moment where Gerald Kuhn's jaw dropped. That's not how things worked in Harlan County in 1961. The silence was slower than that, and in some ways, slower silences are louder. Let me tell you what happened over the next 15 years. By the fall of 1963, 2 years after the wall was completed, the silt accumulation on the uphill side had reached approximately 3 inches in the areas of highest flow concentration. Eldon began seeing something else: volunteer grass growing in the accumulated material behind the wall. Buffalo grass and western wheatgrass, carried in by wind and water, take root in the new accumulation of fine soil, ground cover that slowed future water movement further. By 1965, 4 years in, he had 6 to 8 inches of accumulated fine silt behind sections of the wall where the flow had been heaviest. He had a narrow strip of grass-stabilized soil running nearly the full length of the structure. The rocky corner of his field, the 40 acres that Gerald Kuhn had called wasted ground, was beginning, very slowly, to develop a new soil horizon. He planted it to alfalfa in 1966. Not wheat. He wasn't ready for a plow crop, wasn't willing to disturb the fragile new topsoil profile he'd built. Alfalfa, with its deep root system, would continue the soil building process, fix nitrogen, and hold the surface together. He seeded it by hand, walking the length of the new ground in the April morning with a canvas seed bag over his shoulder, the way his father had seeded ground in 1902. By 1968, he was cutting 3 tons of alfalfa per acre from ground that had been considered unfarmable 7 years before. At the going price of $22 per ton, that was $66 per acre. Across 38 acres, the approximate extent of ground he had brought into production, that was $2,508 per cutting. He cuts it twice a year. He never mentioned this to Gerald Kuhn. But farmers notice things. Farmers drive section roads and look at other men's fields the way readers look at other people's bookshelves, always cataloging, always comparing, always learning. And by 1969, the Winkelbauer brothers and Harold Sveck and Lester Horak and Earl Mosby had all driven past that north corner enough times to understand what they were seeing. "That's the old rocky corner," Dale Winkelbauer said to his brother Don, the first time they drove past and saw the alfalfa standing there, thick and green and improbable. "Can't be," Don said. "It is, I'm telling you, that's where the wall is." In 1971, a soil conservation agent from the University of Nebraska Extension named Thomas Abernethy drove out to Eldon Pruitt's farm as part of a county-wide survey of erosion control practices. He walked the wall with Eldon for 2 hours. He took soil samples from the accumulated material on the uphill side of the wall and from the field areas above and below it. The results came back 3 weeks later. The accumulated material behind the wall had a pH of 7.1, an organic matter content of 3.4%, and a soil structure classification of silty clay loam, essentially identical to the best native topsoil in the county. Eldon had in 10 years rebuilt the equivalent of what geologists would estimate took between 500 and 1,000 years to form naturally. Thomas Abernethy wrote it up in a bulletin that was distributed to every extension office in Nebraska and Kansas. He called the technique contour stone berming. He described it as a variant of traditional European drystone terrace farming, adapted to the specific conditions of the Republican River Valley. He noted that the practice required no purchased materials, no equipment beyond what the farmer already owned, and could be constructed over a period of weeks to months. He did not put Eldon Pruitt's name in the bulletin. But every farmer in Harlan County knew who had done it first. Gerald Kuhn read that bulletin. He read it 3 times. Then he drove out to Eldon Pruitt's farm on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1971, 10 years after he had laughed in Vander Beek's feed store, and he knocked on the door. Eldon came to the door in his stocking feet, holding a cup of coffee. He was 71 years old. His hair had gone fully white. His hands were the same color of creek mud they had always been. "Eldon," Gerald said. He stopped. He seemed to be working out how to say something. I owe you an apology. Eldon looked at him. I was wrong about those rocks, Gerald said. I was wrong about a lot of it. Eldon was quiet for a moment, then he said, You want a cup of coffee, Gerald? I'd appreciate that, Gerald said. They sat at Eldon's kitchen table for an hour. Gerald asked questions. Eldon answered them, not with triumph, not with any trace of the satisfaction that a lesser man might have felt. He talked about contour and water velocity and silt deposition and the way dry stack walls fail when the cap stones shift and how to prevent it. He talked about the Hofmeister fence and what he had learned from watching it in 1931. Gerald Kuhn listened the way a man listens when he is genuinely trying to learn something, which is a different kind of listening than most men do. He listened with his whole body. When he left, he shook Eldon's hand at the door. He held it a moment longer than was customary. I should have asked you what you knew, Gerald said, instead of telling you what I thought. You were doing your job, Eldon said, no hard feelings. By 1975, Eldon Pruitt's wall had become a minor landmark in Harlan County. The Extension Service had used it as a demonstration site for 2 consecutive years. 3 neighboring farmers had built their own contour stone berms, following the principles that Eldon had worked out by observation and instinct. A younger farmer named Kyle Rademacher had driven out from Adams County specifically to walk the wall and take photographs. Eldon Pruitt died in March of 1979. He was 79 years old. He died in his own bed in his own house on his own land, the land that Antonin Prucha had arrived at with $11 and a pocketknife, the land that had survived the Dust Bowl and the Depression and 2 droughts and 30 years of rocky ground that everyone called waste. Raymond drove down from Lincoln for the funeral. He walked the wall the morning after his father was buried in the early light, alone. He stood at the east end and looked down its 341-foot length. The alfalfa field behind it was brown and dormant in the March cold, but the soil there was 8 inches deeper than it had been in 1961. 8 inches of topsoil built back from nothing by a man with a stone boat and a 1948 Farmall M and 30 years of patient observation. Raymond Pruitt kept the farm. He farms it still, or rather, his son does now. The wall is there. It will be there in 100 years. Limestone, stacked without mortar, held together by nothing but weight and precision and the knowledge of a man who understood that what everyone called waste was actually something else entirely. Let me pause here and ask you something. How many times in your life have you seen something that everyone agreed was worthless and known, in that quiet place below the level of words, that they were wrong? And how many times did you act on it? Eldon Pruitt lived in a world that rewarded the new and dismissed the old. A world where Gerald Kuhn's Honda Maroon Impala and his John Deere dealership and his easy confidence about what was obsolete carried weight, social weight, economic weight, the weight of the times. And Eldon Pruitt, with his Risold boots and his 3 identical pairs of Oshkosh overalls and his 15-year-old Farmall M, was on the wrong side of all of it, by every measure that the world had decided to use. But Eldon Pruitt was in possession of something that Gerald Kuhn's equipment catalog had no entry for. He had been watching water move across a particular piece of ground. 30 years of noticing. 30 years of thinking about the Hofmeister fence and what it meant and what it might become if a man applied it with intention. He didn't need anyone to believe him. He didn't need anyone to understand what he was doing. He didn't lobby for recognition or explain his thinking to the skeptics or argue back against the laughter in Vander Beek's feed store. He just picked up a rock. And then he got another one. There is a philosophy of farming that runs through the history of American agriculture like a river, sometimes above ground, sometimes below it, but always there. It is a philosophy that says the land is not a resource to be extracted but a relationship to be maintained, that the knowledge of a piece of ground accumulates across decades, and that the farmer who has worked the same field for 30 years knows things about it that no expert driving past can see. That patience is not a passive condition but an active one, a form of intelligence, a way of paying attention that eventually generates understanding. Eldon Pruitt understood this the way he understood the feel of his tractor's idle, not because he had read it somewhere, but because it had been demonstrated to him by the land itself over the full span of his working life. The rocks were not waste, they were a resource waiting for the right question. The rocky corner was not a problem, it was a solution that hadn't been asked for yet. The old Farmall M, the machine that Gerald Kuhn had called obsolete in 1958, 1959, 1960, and 1961, That machine hauled 50 tons of limestone on a homemade stone boat across a Nebraska summer and helped build 341 feet of wall that is still standing today. It didn't need to be modern. It needed to be there. It needed to be running. And it needed an operator who knew what he was doing. The quiet farmers, the ones with the risoled boots and the worn overalls and the machines that everyone else has written off, are often in possession of the most important knowledge in the room. Not because they are stubborn, not because they are behind the times, but because they have been paying attention long enough to know things that can't be found in a catalog. Eldon Pruitt never got rich, he never got famous. Thomas Abernethy's extension bulletin didn't put his name in it, no one gave him an award. But his wall is still there. His land is deeper and richer than it was in 1961. The ground that everyone called waste, the rocky corner that Gerald Kuhn used as evidence that Eldon was obsolete, that ground is now some of the most productive soil on that farm. And on a clear morning in early spring, when the light comes across the Republican River Valley at a low angle and the alfalfa is just breaking through the surface behind the wall, the stone looks almost warm, like it's been there forever, like it was always supposed to be that way. Maybe it was.